James A. Garfield steps onto the national stage with the air of someone who has already worn half a dozen lives and is suspicious of fame because it looks too much like a costume. He is born in a one-room cabin in Orange Township, Ohio, the last child of a widowed mother who has nothing to offer but work and the belief that work is convertible into dignity. The boy is small, eager, and afflicted with a restlessness that in a harsher age might have been called fate. He runs away to the canal, becomes a mule driver, learns the night rhythm of towpaths and the profanity of men who live by weather. He nearly dies of fever, returns to the cabin chastened and taller, and confronts the unglamorous truth at the heart of the American promise. Books are ladders, and ladders do not climb themselves. At the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, later Hiram College, he reads languages until his tongue aches and logics until the world begins to show its hinges. He is so hungry for instruction that the line between student and teacher blurs. Soon he is both, lecturing by day, cramming by night, graduating to Williams College, and bringing back to Ohio a method and a polish that never extinguish the frontier candor in his voice. He marries his fellow student and quiet counterpart, Lucretia Rudolph, Crete, whose devotion to order, texts, and understatement will later be the only gravity strong enough to anchor a life pulled by politics. He enters the Disciples of Christ ministry because faith, to him, is not theater, but grammar. Sentences about duty that you live or you do not deserve to speak. Teaching, preaching, legislating, a ladder of plain rooms, carry him into the Ohio Senate as the Republic begins to heat. He is not a showy orator. He is an organizer of thought, one of those rare men who can take a crowd's confusion and repeat it back in a way that makes everyone feel smarter and more decent. When the war comes, he does not perform anguish. He recruits. The 42nd Ohio seeks a colonel who can make farmers into soldiers. Garfield becomes the solution because he knows how to lay out a syllabus, and because the syllabus now includes marching, maps, and the difference between courage and noise. His first campaign in the Big Sandy Valley of Kentucky ends at Middle Creek, where he uses terrain the way a lawyer uses precedent, turning hills into arguments, forcing an enemy twice his size to retreat. The newspapers learn the name and decide it belongs on a list. His men learn the name and decide it belongs on a muster roll. He advances to the Army of the Ohio, then to the staff of Don Carlos Buell, and finally to the Army of the Cumberland under William S. Rosecrans, where his intellectual restlessness finds the kind of work that never ends: staff analysis, reconnaissance, riding the lines with nervous energy, and an eye for the one place a plan will fail. At Chickamauga, when the battle has turned from a chess problem into an accident in the woods, he performs the act his friends will call courage and his enemies will later dismiss as luck. He rides through a storm of gunfire from Rosecrans's collapsing right to George Thomas, the Rock, who is holding the left together with the stubbornness of a granite outcrop. That ride, in the memory of the men who saw him vanish and reappear, was not a gesture. It was a message delivered under conditions that made message and messenger indistinguishable. The recommendation he writes afterward, to attack, to seize, to move rather than wait, carries his temperament in its verbs. Promotion follows. He is still under 33, now a major general of volunteers, and the United States House of Representatives, to which he had been elected while still in the field, is suddenly the next hill rather than a hypothetical. He hesitates long enough to be honest about the thing he loves. Soldiers are reading his orders as if they were reasons. But the Republic needs reasons in committee rooms and on the floor, and he accepts the order to return to Washington, not as an invitation upward, but as a consequence of survival. He becomes in Congress what he had been in the Army, a problem solver whose talent is to keep two truths in the same sentence until they learn how to live together. On committees that decide taxes and tariffs, he is the one who reads the footnotes. On questions of finance that will become the great American headache of the post-war decades, greenbacks, specie, resumption, he is a hard money man by intellect and a sympathetic listener by instinct, the rare combination that can vote for arithmetic while not insulting the men who live under it. He is not immune to the time's tawdry gravity. The Credit Mobilier scandal touches him. Stock in a construction shell for the Union Pacific had been sprinkled like salt over influential hands. Garfield's own conduct, by his account and his ledgers, involved no profit and little attention, a paper flirtation rather than graft. He is censured by rumor more than by law, wounded in reputation, but not destroyed, and the wound leaves a scar that opponents will press in every future debate. He survives because his colleagues, even those jealous of his gifts, believe in his basic decency, and because he is the kind of adversary who, pressed very hard, can write a speech that makes adversaries careful. He is present for the slow-burn constitutional crisis of 1876 to 77, when the Hayes-Tilden election travels from courthouse to commission like a fever trying out different bodies. On the Electoral Commission, he becomes the lawyer the Republicans trust to dismantle arguments with courtesy. He helps extinguish a fire without convincing a nation that ashes are clean. By 1880, he has become, in the phrases newspapermen wear out through overuse, the most able man in the House, minority leader, floor general, algebraist of votes. His name is not on anyone's presidential list. He arrives at the Republican convention in Chicago as manager and nominator for John Sherman, his patron and Ohio's claim to the chair. The party is a quarrel conducted by professionals, the stalwarts of Roscoe Conkling, who want Ulysses Grant for a third term and the comfortable ecosystem of the Custom House preserved, the half-breeds of James G. Blaine, who want a reformer and the laurels that come with it, the faithful of Sherman, who want competence without fireworks. Ballot after ballot, the hall refuses decisiveness. Garfield, on the platform, delivers the nominating speech for Sherman with such clarity and moral balance that the hall cheers for the man giving the speech, not the man it advertises. In deadlock, a party turns to the one figure not exhausted by enmities. Garfield becomes the compromise it can respect. He protests with sincerity that he has not sought the nomination. He also understands, with the cold quickness of a man who has seen cavalry turn a flank, that when a moment arrives, you ride toward it, or you will spend the rest of your life explaining why you didn't. He accepts, and the ticket is sharpened with a concession to machine power. Chester A. Arthur of New York, a Conkling intimate for vice president. The campaign that follows is fought from a porch in Mentor, Ohio, where crowds step off trains and wagons to hear a kind of speech that does not sound like a speech at all. Garfield prefers the well-made argument to the well-made shout. He speaks of education, tariffs, hard money, and reconciliation with the South without permitting reconciliation to become forgetfulness. He is a veteran addressing veterans. He is a canal boy addressing shopkeepers. He is a classical scholar ready to recite Greek for the amusement of professors, but determined to make the Republic accessible to men who do not need the heiress to find their polling place. He wins by a narrow popular margin and a safe electoral one after New York tips toward him. He wins in the shadow of a forged Maury letter that purported to show him favoring an open door to Chinese labor. He denounces it as a lie, which it is, and in the shadow of suspicion sown by every faction he has not anointed. He prepares to govern with a mind that remembers what it felt like to be driven like a mule along a towpath, and a pride that has learned to hide itself behind humor. His inaugural is an essay in confidence without braggadocio. He speaks of civil rights in an era that is learning to speak euphemism. He links the progress of Black Americans to the progress of the United States, as if the connection were obvious and not a proposition half the country refuses to admit. He speaks of education as a public duty and of the presidency as a limited machine that must not be asked to do what Congress, states, and citizens must do themselves. He appoints James G. Blaine at State, a brilliant, touchy genius who can turn friendship into geometry, because he wants an energetic foreign policy that looks south and west as well as across the Atlantic. He names Thomas L. James Postmaster General, a reformer known for honesty and for a willingness to stanch the arterial bleeding of postal contracts. He gives other departments to men more intent on work than on symbology. The message is not an insult to the stalwarts. It is a refusal to treat the federal government as burial ground for debts. Conkling understands. He and his ally, Senator Thomas Platt of New York, plan to discipline the new president by disciplining his patronage choices, especially the crown jewel of spoils, the New York Custom House. The fight arrives disguised as a nomination. Garfield chooses William H. Robertson, an anti-Conkling Republican, for collector of the Port of New York. To Conkling, the appointment is heresy. Control of the port means control of assessments, of men, of tides. He insists that a custom house belongs to a senator the way a family pew belongs to the eldest surviving aunt. Garfield replies by invoking a principle newer than any aunt's memory. The president is not a clerk of the Senate. He refuses to abandon Robertson. Conkling and Platt attempt a melodrama. They resign their seats, return to Albany, and demand re-election as a public referendum on their honor and the ancient rights of patronage. They expect submission. They receive a civics lesson. After weeks of wrangling, the New York legislature declines to reseat them. The president has defeated the state's master operator with the patience of a schoolteacher correcting a bully's grammar, a constitutional rebuke disguised as personnel. In the consequence of this one fight, the federal system shifts. The executive has asserted the right to staff an executive function according to public service rather than faction. 100 editorials that once treated reform as the hobby of saints suddenly treat it as achievable. If Garfield had done nothing else, this would still be a hinge. He plans to do more. With blame, he sketches a foreign policy that treats the Americas as a concert and not as a field. He imagines a Pan-American conference where trade and arbitration replace sporadic sympathy and habitual condescension. He prefers reciprocity treaties to sermons, is open to naval modernization as shield rather than swagger, and instructs Blaine to think of an Isthmian canal as a civil instrument rather than a military trophy, an engineering problem that should be solved by neutrality and law before ambition turns it into a fuse. At the post office, Janes begins a methodical dismantling of the star route frauds, contracts for mail delivery in the interior awarded to companies that bill for impossible service on impossible schedules. Indictments are prepared. More important than the trials is the message that the era of automatic tolerance is concluding. He encourages his Treasury secretaries to remain orthodox. Pay what the government owes, owe what the government can pay, mistrust inflation's siren, continue the quiet work of resumption and stability, begun under predecessors. On race, he chooses words that risk votes. The amendment we wrote into the Constitution must be lived into the counties that prefer to call it penance. Schools administered by states should be aided by federal dollars where states use money to hide malice. He knows the votes exist neither in Congress nor in the country. He says it anyway. He is trying to teach, and the office gives him a voice. If not yet a choir, he is, beneath every public diagram, still a mind that loves problems for their solvability rather than their spectacle. He has written a proof of the Pythagorean theorem, a neat trapezoid argument whose elegance pleased mathematicians because it looked like a man in love with balance. He can write Greek and Latin on a blackboard simultaneously with either hand, not as parlor trick, but as a sign that discipline and play can be neighbors. He reads the German historians when he should be sleeping, and the Bible when he needs to remind himself that a sentence can bind and release in the same breath. He is a husband who depends upon his wife's careful housekeeping of facts. The letters between them are not romantic in the ordinary sense, but they are a romance of intellect and mutual trust, the only kind that can survive Washington's harvest of gossip. Then, on a hot July morning, the physics of a republic change because a deranged man with an inflated sense of his own grievance discovers a pistol and a president at the Seine train station. Charles Guiteau imagines himself overlooked for due reward, imagines himself the agent of a faction, imagines himself a hero in a melodrama whose script does not exist. He stalks, then shoots. The bullet enters Garfield near the arm, and travels inward, lodging where a competent surgeon, given a different culture, might have left well enough alone. Instead, the 19th century performs one of its tragedies. Physicians probe with unwashed fingers and unsterilized instruments because European antisepsis, available in journals, has not yet become American habit. The wound becomes an experiment in the cultivation of germs. Garfield is moved to the White House, then, in September, to a cottage by the sea in Elberon, New Jersey, because a breeze looks like medicine when medicine has run out of knowledge. Alexander Graham Bell arrives with an induction device, trying to find the bullet's metallic whisper. The detector fails because the bed's metal slats answer more loudly than the slug. The newspapers print daily bulletins that are half devotion and half pornography. The people gather as if you were a camp meeting. For 79 days, the president lives between sentences. He receives friends, signs a few papers, listens to the surf, and tries not to admit that pain is writing a diary of its own in his nerves. On September 19, 1881, the diary ends. Chester A. Arthur, who had been appointed to appease Conkling and who had been used to laughter in reform circles as a synonym for the machine, becomes president, and in one of those American reversals that save the country from complete cynicism, governs with a converted conscience, signing the Civil Service Act that Garfield's stand had made inevitable, dismissing men he had once carried water for, practicing decency because death had instructed him. It is the afterlife of Garfield's short tenure. The assassination that was meant to restore patronage's empire instead accelerates its curtailment. The Pendleton Act of 1883, fathered by outrage and midwifed by a president few expected to perform the role, begins the merit system in law. It is not perfect, it is anchorage. The custom house can no longer be farmed. Offices begin to require examinations. The Treasury stops functioning as a party club. Garfield's will survives him in statutes that cannot be unsigned. To say that he died so that this could be true is to indulge in cheap holiness. Better to say that he dared a confrontation at the exact moment when the country's stomach for it had matured. And that martyrdom gave a resolution the emotional force politics alone could not supply. What else survives? His example as a scholar in politics, which is rarer than one might wish. He showed that classical learning, far from making a man brittle or ornate, can make him patient. He could quote Thucydides without pretending to be Pericles. He could find in Euclid not parlor proofs, but a love of the shortest path from premise to consequence. In a House of Representatives that often behaved like a combination store and coliseum, he pursued the craft as if it were a university with a stubborn curriculum. Learn the problem thoroughly, respect the intelligence of those who disagree. Commit to a vote when the time for arguments has ended. Go to dinner with your opponent if he will go. He respected Black Americans openly in a period when white Northern politicians were learning the art of respectful silence. He supported the universities and schools that freed people were building. He sought, in the language of budgets, to do what lofty phrases pretended would happen by itself. He refused to flatter the lost cause. He refused to let reconciliation become a flattery of people who demanded compliments as a fee for peace. He was not a saint. He enjoyed praise and maneuvered for it when necessary. He could be sharp in caucus and cool to people whose usefulness had expired. He navigated factions with a professional's ability to present one face to this room and another to that one without forfeiting his sense of self. He had the ordinary ambition of a man who discovered he was good at difficult things and wanted those things to be larger. But the ratio in him between ambition and duty stayed favorable longer than it does in most biographies. He had learned restraint in poverty, in camp, and in Crete's temperate presence. He believed the Republic needed eloquence less than it needed accountability. He preferred finishing to announcing. The sadness that pervades his story comes not from a cut string of destiny. No man is guaranteed the time he thinks he deserves, but from the visible list of tasks he had sketched and set in motion. The reform conflict, the postal prosecutions, the Pan-American idea, the green shoots of a civil service that would eventually anchor a modern state, the federal defense of a black vote still being hunted in the night. The neatness he thought could be induced in the budget if the executive insisted long enough. There is a smaller ledger that belongs to his private life, and that ledger tells a countervailing truth. His short presidency spared him, and spared the country, the slow erosion that Washington exacts, even from those who come with excellent teeth. His letters from 1881 do not yet sound tired. His plans do not yet smell of defensive calculation. He has not yet been forced to choose between alienating reformers by temporizing and alienating partymen by accelerating. He has not yet suffered the 1,000 insults that make good men learn the wrong lessons about cynicism. He never had to live through a midterm that would have punished him for refusing to turn the White House into a syndicate. He is, in the Museum of American Possibilities, a case of arrested development that reads like a kindness. It is cruel to say that of a man whose wife had to dress wounds daily and whose children learned early the shape of grief. But a nation is permitted to hear kindness in the limits of a narrative, too. Garfield is the president who demonstrated that an executive can face down a machine and still plan a foreign policy, who proved you can be learned without being condescending, who made of a rural education a cosmopolitan discipline, who found in number and sentence a pair of tools that, held together, can make law better than either can alone. Imagine him alive longer, and you imagine a second American lesson written more legibly. Perhaps the Pan-American Conference convenes under his auspices and rewrites the etiquette of hemispheric quarrels. Perhaps the Star Route trials conclude with a larger set of convictions and a narrower set of evasions. Perhaps the patronage fight accelerates and his party, chastened by Conkling's humiliation, forgives him for closing the tills. Perhaps his moral insistence on education funding becomes a budget line instead of remaining a lonely speech that reformers quote to one another while the Appropriations Committee yawns. Perhaps he is tested by a recession and chooses well, by a riot and chooses well, by an international insult and chooses the letter over the saber, and the result is not mocked. Perhaps he makes a second demonstration of executive independence without inviting the Senate to treat him as a usurper. The perhapses are not certainties. They are the fruits his first months suggest might have ripened. History rarely allows such generosity. The universe offered him a single summer, then closed the book. After he dies, the funeral train rolls like a whole people trying to say they are better than the worst thing that happened to them. The tracks through Pennsylvania and Ohio sprout with mourners who knew him as congressman, professor, friend, or rumor. The wreaths pile up. The sermons grow tender, because most ministers in America looked up the day he was shot and felt that in the violence, a parishioner had bled on the steps of the altar. He is laid to rest in Cleveland in a monument that looks like a castle built by gratitude. Inside are mosaics that shine the way marble never can, because tiny fragments do a better job of telling the truth about how a life is assembled. Crete never marries again. She keeps his papers with a librarian's jealousy and a lover's caution. She raises boys to men with quiet iron. She becomes an all but name, the curator of a memory the country deserves to have. What does that memory give back? A way of understanding merit that is not smug and not desperate. A way of imagining the presidency as a porch where a man can speak in complete sentences and still be understood by farmers and editors. A way of insisting that civil service is not merely an efficiency, but a moral necessity, because a government that sells jobs will eventually sell justice. He is the demonstration that a mind trained to love proofs can love people, that a hand trained to row canal boats can sign papers that make life safer for strangers, that religion can become a style of honesty rather than a cudgel. He is also a reminder that the Republic's greatest domestic enemies are rarely men with grand conspiracies. More often, they are men whose grievances teach them to worship themselves, men who have learned to translate envy into righteousness and righteousness into bullets. It remains useful to say, when the country forgets itself, that a president was once elected for being learned and decent, and was killed for refusing to make a marketplace out of offices. It remains useful to say that the reforms carrying his name into 1883 and beyond were not conjured out of sentimental tears, but hammered into law by the combination of his defiance and Arthur's conversion. It remains useful to remember that the style of speech Garfield practiced, the instructive, careful, sinewed sentence, makes a nation calmer even when it cannot make it kinder. And that calmness is sometimes the precondition of kindness, just as arithmetic is sometimes the precondition of generosity. He was not perfect. He was adequate to the work. He was not allowed to complete the work. We live, still, in the better part of what he began. If you want one scene to keep in a pocket for hard days, take this: the professor-president, sitting at a rough desk in Mentor, in the blue hour before dawn, a cup of coffee cooling, a draft of an inaugural paragraph on the left, and a notice of a postmaster's death on the right, the gas lamp turning his hair into a simple crown. He writes a line about opportunity that does not flatter the rich or the poor, only the diligent. He writes a note to a widow, reminding her that the government can be gentle when it tries. He looks at the proofs of an algebra text a friend has sent and smiles, because the proof is wrong, but almost beautifully right. He hears the first wagon on the road, the rooster 3 farms over, the distant whistle of a train that will deliver a crowd to his lawn that afternoon, to be told again that citizenship is a thing you do, not a label you wear. He folds the notes with a care that suggests that even small papers deserve dignity. He straightens the pen. He stands. He begins the day. The country, as usual, is larger than any one man, but for a little while it fit inside his voice.
Midnight rails under silver moon, dusty boots on a winding road. A shadow's the only friend I've known since she packed up and let me go. Empty whiskey bottle on the seat, her laugh still echoes in my bones. Saddle's heavy with memories. I ride alone where the wind still blows. Nowhere else to be. 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 Sunrise paints the horizon gold, but it don't warm a lonesome soul. Every town I pass feels half her size. Every trail's haunted by goodbye. I whisper prayers to open skies, hoping someday my heart'll find a brand new path beyond the pain, where broken hearts can heal in time. Nowhere else to be. 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 Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be.